In ESO, tanks have multiple ways to mitigate damage. One of the most important are damage shields. Damage shields provide a buffer between your health and the damage you are taking. With how prevalent hard-hitting damage over time effects have become, tanks heavily rely on damage shields far more than ever. Damage shields have pros and cons and can give and take depending on the situation. However, most of the time damage shields will just act as a buffer between damage and your health. In this video, I want to go over these pros and cons and go over more situations where damage shields are useful and the times that they might not be a good thing to actually use. Damage shields are typically strong against damage over time effects. Damage over time usually hits for far less initially, but more over time than direct damage from enemies. Since dots do their damage over time, you'll be taking consistent damage and a lot of dots tick faster than you can be healed. Using a damage shield against these can end up helping your healers as you'll mitigate some of the ticks of damage, making it easier to heal your health. The other time damage shields are very useful is when you have a lot of smaller adds attacking you that don't deal a lot of damage. Having multiple smaller enemies attacking you, while you could block all of it, you would end up losing a lot of stamina. Meanwhile, you could just pop a damage shield and negate most of the damage anyway. Overall, damage shields are great against dots and great against a lot of smaller attacks. The barrier helps prevent you from losing too much health, and if something is ticking too quickly, you can pop a shield to let your healers catch up to your health. Generally speaking, if we look at the 4 major tank classes, we can see that damage shields are overall more efficient than healing as a tank. Most heals on a tank are super situational or have some sort of caveat that makes them harder to use. However, the main caveat to damage shields is they scale off of your max health, so the lower health you have, the smaller the shield is, but this usually doesn't end up making that big of a difference. Before going over more specifics, I want to really quickly go over when damage shields won't help you very much. The major downside to damage shields are they aren't affected by mitigation and are applied first to all damage. If we look at a boss like Olms from a Silent Sanctorum, we can see why damage shields against high hitting attacks don't really do much. Olms does around 155,000 damage per light attack. Since damage shields don't get affected by mitigation and are applied first, we can look at the damage taken between popping the damage shield and without popping it. If we use this sort of scuffed build, we can go in and only block. We'll take around 11,252 damage. If we then pop a 5,775 damage shield before getting hit, we only reduce the damage to 9,924. We go from around 93% mitigation to a whopping 94%, or an actual difference of 1,328 damage. This is because since the damage shield is eaten first, the attack's base damage is so high, the damage shield doesn't really make a difference in how much damage he's going to do. The other time damage shields become completely useless is when fighting Oblivion damage. Oblivion damage completely ignores damage shields and does damage straight to your health. Examples of this mechanic are the Bleed from Ysella in VSC, and also Dead Star from Zelvaka and Rockgrove. Both of these attacks cannot be damage shield through and will just do damage straight to anyone's health hit by them. Overall, the major negative of damage shields is when you're dealing with high direct damage like Fallgraven's heavy, Zelvaka's heavy, or any heavy that just does a crap load of damage. Along with this, Oblivion damage makes shields completely useless. Having saying that, I really quickly want to go over a certain class that breaks how damage shields should be used, as a lot of its survivability comes from one skill. This class is the Arcanist. Arcanist's main survivability comes from the skill Impervious Rune Ward. Along with healing you, Impervious Rune Ward also acts as a damage shield, and within its first second of cast, the damage shield is massively increased to the point where shielding heavies can actually be useful. Arcanists can easily get the shield strength over 30k for the first second of cast. This can end up taking a decent chunk out of most attacks in the game. Looking at specific classes, I want to use the DK as they're probably the most played class and have some really good damage shield options. I also want to use both the extremes when looking at the good and the bad ideas for using damage shields. For the first example, I want to use Fallgraven. I want to use Fallgraven because he actually is really nice for both good ideas for damage shields and also some really bad times to use damage shields. On the first and last floor of Fallgraven's fight, you'll be dealing with a dot effect called Grievous Pulse. This effect isn't blockable and does ramping damage over time. On the first floor of Fallgraven, the group will most likely use a barrier to help the group survive the lightning phase. As a tank, you can help the group survive by supplementing the barrier with extra damage shields from Igneous Shield. This can help the group survive Conga phase, as the damage ramp is quite harsh in this phase. On final floor of Fallgraven during execute, you'll be dealing with Grievous Pulse the entire time. Using damage shields can help the DPS and healers survive the phase and overall make the phase quite a bit easier. While this might make damage shields seem pretty strong in this fight, for the OT and the MT, the damage shields are quite literally useless. I do not know the base damage of Fallgraven or Lieutenant Dan's heavy attacks, however, getting hit by them will strip your damage shield no matter the size pretty much instantly and do the remaining damage to your health. Unless you're casting a damage shield for the group, there's really no point to casting a damage shield to help mitigate any of this damage. Especially with Fallgraven's heavy, he will rip straight through it, and even in execute, blocking the heavy attack usually isn't the best idea as he'll probably one-shot you with a Grievous Pulse. Overall, this is a good example of when damage shields are good to use for the group while also still being pretty bad to use on the actual tanks themselves. Onto an example where the tank wants to use a damage shield for selfish reasons. For this example, we're going to look at Bosse Hard Mode in Rockgrove. Bosse notoriously does most of her damage with the Death Touch. Death Touch will basically always be present as Bosse will continuously scythe throughout the entire fight. This damage is unblockable and unavoidable. To help healers keep up with the dot, it's usually generally a good idea to run some sort of damage shield on this fight. Quick side note, I was going to use the dot damage the OT is tanking, however, it's just a lot of damage, and usually the OT is a crow, which notoriously does not have any damage shields. Overall, damage shields are an extremely strong tool in the kit of tanks, however, a lot of people seem to misunderstand when shields are actually good to be used. The reason I made this video is, one, I wanted to get some information for myself and look at some of the fights where damage shields would be practically useless so I can take them off my bar. 2, I was doing a VK hard mode in Crag and there was a tank struggling with mag sustain. We had done very good up until Fallgraven, but for some reason when he was tanking Dan, he just couldn't survive it and his mag sustain was dumping. However, because of this fight, I did realize that the game doesn't teach you why damage shields are useful and the times that they're not actually that good. There's nothing in the game to help you figure out, hey, is this going to be a good idea to use, like when is a damage shield useful and when is it not? This is something you just have to learn by trial and error, and over time you'll get an understanding of when damage shields are useful. But yeah, that's about it, and I hope you enjoyed and thanks for watching.